In this lecture, you are going to learn about the European theater, the Pacific theater, and the end of the war. The United States entered the war with the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and within a week of Pearl Harbor, the United States had declared war on the entire Axis powers, turning two previously separate conflicts into a true world war. The war was now between the Axis, consisting of Italy, Germany, and Japan, and the Allies, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Axis had been at it since the 1930s and had trained troops and an expansive army. Initially, German subs sank scores of American ships in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. However, the Allies had numerical superiority, a unified military command structure in Western Europe directed by General Dwight Eisenhower, almost unlimited natural resources and industrial capacity in America, immune to bombardment, as well as inspirational leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill. Also, in Europe, Allies arrived as liberators rather than conquerors. Hitler didn't have reliable leadership and couldn't even trust his own people. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Hitler's Eastern Front armies marched deeper into the Soviet Union, while his Western forces prepared to invade Britain. Until mid-1943, the war in the Atlantic remained undecided, but the introduction of radar detectors and sufficient number of destroyer escorts eventually drove the Nazi U-boats from the North Atlantic in late May 1943. The most important strategic question confronting the United States and its allies after that was when and where to open a second front against the Nazis. Stalin demanded that America and Britain mount an immediate and massive assault into Western France to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Roosevelt and Churchill instead delayed opening a second front, allowing the Germans and the Soviets to slug it out. Roosevelt and Churchill decided to strike first in North Africa to help secure Allied control of the Mediterranean. In November, the first American combat troops entered the European war, landing in French Morocco and pushing the Germans east while the British pushed west. By May of 1943, the Allied armies defeated the Germans in North Africa, made the Mediterranean safe for Allied shipping, and opened the door for the Allied invasion of Italy. In January 1943, while the North African campaign was still underway, Roosevelt traveled to Casablanca to confer with Churchill. The leaders announced that they will accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, ruling out peace negotiations. They concluded that they should capitalize on their success in North Africa and strike against Italy, as they were not yet prepared for the invasion of France that Stalin demanded. Leaving Stalin to bear the brunt of the Nazi war machine for another year. In July 1943, combined American and British forces landed in Sicily. The Italian government surrendered unconditionally, but German troops dug into strong fortifications and fought to defend every inch of Italy's rugged terrain for the remainder of the war. While the Allied campaigns in North Africa and Italy were underway, British and American pilots flew bombing missions from England to the continent as an air bomb substitute for the delayed Second Front on the ground. The plan was to bomb Germany around the clock. American bombers hit German ball-bearing factories, rail yards, oil fields, and manufacturing centers during the day, while the British RAF carpet-bombed German cities at night. Flying in formation, they initially flew unescorted, since many believe that bombers equipped with defensive firepower flew too high and too fast to be attacked. However, advanced German technology allowed fighters to easily shoot down American bombers. On some missions, the Germans shot down almost 50% of American aircraft. German air defenses took a fearsome toll on Allied pilots and aircraft until the arrival in February 1944 of the P-51 Mustang fighter, which gave Allied bomber pilots superior protection. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to fight the Germans. For months, German and Soviet soldiers fought for every street and every house at Stalingrad. When winter came, the Red Army counterattacked and encircled the city. In February of 1943, the German army at Stalingrad surrendered. After Stalingrad, the tide turned and the Soviet army launched a major counteroffensive, defeating Germans on the Eastern Front. In the wake of the Soviets' victory at Stalingrad, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in Tehran in November of 1943. Dismissing Africa and Italy as a sideshow, Stalin demanded that Britain and the United States invade France to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Churchill was hesitant, but Roosevelt was eager. Codename Overlord, the offensive was scheduled to begin in May 1944. The huge deployment of Hitler's armies to the east, which were trying to halt the Red Army's westward offensive, left too few German troops to stop the millions of Allied soldiers waiting to attack. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, General Dwight Eisenhower launched the largest amphibious assault in world history. Within a week, a flood of Allied soldiers, tanks, and other military equipment were sweeping east towards Germany. Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force and had overseen the planning and preparations for the biggest amphibious campaign in history. Despite bad weather conditions, he gave the order for the invasion to commence late in the evening of June 5th, having been advised that the weather was likely to improve on June 6th and then worsen over the following days. Eisenhower's message to the troops assembled for the invasion was the following: soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on the other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed people of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely, but this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 1941. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and place at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. On June 6, 1944, some 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the coast of France's Normandy region. The D-Day invasion was not easy. The beaches were heavily fortified. German casualties on D-Day have been estimated at 4,000 to 9,000 men. Allied casualties were documented for at least 10,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead. The Germans had mined the beaches and even used innovative technology such as this remote-control Goliath tank that was filled with explosives and intended to be run up the landing ramps of the landing boats on the Normandy beaches. Moreover, the Germans had the upper ground. At 100 feet high, Point du Hoc was the highest point between Utah and Omaha beaches. It took 2 days to take the cliffs at the cost of over 130 casualties. But the Allies continued to fight it off. Less than a week later, on June 11, the beaches were fully secured and over 326,000 troops, more than 50,000 vehicles, and some 100,000 tons of equipment had landed at Normandy. In the ensuing weeks, the Allies fought their way across the Normandy countryside in the face of determined German resistance, as well as a dense landscape. By the end of June, the Allies had landed approximately 850,000 men and 150,000 vehicles in Normandy and were poised to continue their march across France. In February 1945, while Allied armies relentlessly pushed German forces backward, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met secretly at Yalta, a Russian resort town, to discuss plans for the post-war future. Roosevelt secured Stalin's promise to permit voters of self-determination by people in Eastern European countries occupied by the Red Army, and the Big Three agreed to the creation of a new international peacekeeping organization, the United Nations. While Allied armies sped towards Berlin, Allied warplanes dropped more bombs after D-Day than in all previous European bombing raids combined. This German poster was issued by the railways authorities to warn people of the dangers of letting their lights show at nighttime. It proclaims, "Your fault," as a figure of death rains bombs into targets lit up by the lights from people's houses nearby. This photograph of a German city taken on the last day of the war in Europe, May 8, 1945, illustrates the huge damage inflicted by the Allied bombing campaign. In April, the Soviets smashed into Berlin. Hitler committed suicide on April 30, and on May 7, the Provisional German government surrendered unconditionally. In the days after the city was captured, suicide rates skyrocketed. Many of the people who killed themselves were women, afraid of Soviet soldiers raping them. Meanwhile, Roosevelt was exhausted and gravely ill with heart disease, but he was determined to remain president until the end of the war. Unfortunately, he did not live to see the end of the war. He will die April 12, 1945, and Americans worried about Harry Truman, his untested successor. In the Pacific Theater, Japan carried out an all-out offensive throughout the Southern Pacific. By 1944, all that stood in the way of Japan's domination of the Southern Pacific was the American stronghold in the Philippines. The Japanese unleashed a withering assault against the Philippines in January 1942. After running out of ammunition and supplies, the garrison of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered in May. The prisoners were marched 18 miles to the prisoner of war camp without food, water, or rest. 10,000 died on the Bataan Death March. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese war machine moved to conquer the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and was poised to strike Australia and New Zealand. In the spring of 1942, General Douglas MacArthur led forces to attack the Japanese in the Philippines, while Admiral Chester W. Nimitz led the battle fleet west from Hawaii to retake Japanese-held islands in the southern and mid-Pacific. In the summer of 1942, American naval victories at the Battle of Coral Sea and the aircraft carrier duel at the Battle of Midway crippled Japan's Pacific naval operations. To dislodge Japan's hold over the Pacific, the U.S. military began island hopping, attacking island after island, bypassing the strongest but seizing those capable of holding airfields to continue pushing Japan out of the region. The Americans and their allies attacked Japanese strongholds by sea, air, and by land, moving island by island towards the Japanese homeland. The combat was vicious. At Guadalcanal, American soldiers saw Japanese soldiers launch suicidal charges rather than surrender. Many Japanese soldiers refused to be taken prisoner or to take prisoners themselves. Such tactics turned the Pacific theater into a more brutal and barbarous conflict than the European theater. Japanese soldiers bled the Americans in their advance across the Pacific. At Iwo an 8-square-mile island of volcanic rock, 17,000 Japanese soldiers held the island against 70,000 Marines for over a month. At the cost of nearly their entire force, the Japanese inflicted almost 30,000 casualties before the island was lost. Nevertheless, by February 1945, American bombers were in range of the mainland. Bombers hit Japan's industrial facilities but suffered high casualties. To spare bomber crews from dangerous daylight raids and to achieve maximum effect against Japan's winning cities, many American bombers dropped incendiary weapons that created massive firestorms and wreaked havoc on Japanese cities. Over 60 Japanese cities were firebombed. American firebombs killed 100,000 civilians in Tokyo in March 1945. In June 1945, after 80 days of fighting and 10,000s of casualties, the Americans captured the island of Okinawa. The mainland of Japan was open before them. It was a viable base from which to launch a full invasion of the Japanese homeland and end the war. By this time, the Japanese were nearly defenseless on the sea and in the air, but their leaders prepared to fight to the death for their homeland. Estimates varied, but given the tenacity of Japanese soldiers fighting on islands far from their home, some officials estimated that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could cause 500,000 American casualties and perhaps millions of Japanese civilians. Historians debate the many motivations that ultimately drove the Americans to use atomic weapons against Japan, and many American officials criticize the decision, but these will be the numbers later cited for government leaders and military officials to justify their cause. Early in the war, fearing that the Germans might develop an atomic bomb, the US government launched the Manhattan Project, a hugely expensive, ambitious program that harnessed atomic energy and create a single weapon capable of leveling entire cities. The Americans successfully exploded the world's first nuclear device, Trinity, in New Mexico in July 1945. The director of the Los Alamos laboratory, where the bomb was designed, later recalled that the event reminded him of Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In mid-July 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final assault on Japan, Truman saw no reason not to use the atomic bomb against Japan if doing so would save American lives. Truman gave Japan an ultimatum, and when Japan refused to surrender unconditionally by Truman's deadline, Truman ordered that an atomic bomb be dropped without warning on a Japanese city. The bomb released over Hiroshima on August 6 leveled the city and incinerated about 100,000 people. Three days later, after the Japanese government still refused to surrender, the second atomic bomb killed nearly as many civilians at Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan on August 15. On September 2nd, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, delegates from the Japanese government formally signed their surrender. World War II was finally over. That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.